The night my brother-in-law grabbed my mother by the wrist, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not fear. Something older than both. Something I had spent 4 years burying under spreadsheets and performance reviews and the careful performance of being someone's harmless little sister. It was Thanksgiving. My sister Nora had just bought a house, a real one, a 4-bedroom colonial in Naperville with a mudroom and a 2-car garage and a finished basement, and she wanted the whole family there to see it. Mom had made her sweet potato casserole. My uncle had driven up from Indianapolis with his wife and their college-age son. My grandmother, 81 years old and still sharp as a tack, had flown in from Scottsdale, and Nora's husband, Brett, had spent 2 weeks telling anyone who would listen that this was his house, his success, his vision for the family. I had driven in from D.C. alone, which, according to Brett, already said everything. I heard him say it to my uncle in the garage before dinner, when they thought no one was within earshot. She's 32 and she drives a 10-year-old Civic. Drives up alone. Always alone. Nora keeps making excuses for her. But the girl's just lost, man. Some people peak in high school and that's just how it goes. I had learned a long time ago not to correct people when they were wrong about me. The job I actually didn't have a clean answer at family dinners. When people asked, I said I worked in federal law enforcement. Which was true, which also usually ended the conversation before it started. So I'd gotten in the habit of saying something vague about government consulting instead, letting them fill in whatever picture made sense to them. And for Brett, the picture he'd filled in over 5 years of holiday dinners was loser, odd duck, career bureaucrat, who'd never figured out how to be a real adult. Fine. I had learned to let people be wrong. Dinner was loud and warm the way Thanksgiving always is. Football on in the background. The table too small for everyone. My grandmother holding court at the end nearest the window. My mom refilling everyone's water glass without being asked. Brett was already on his 3rd beer by the time the turkey came out. He had one of those last that was designed to fill rooms, broad and theatrical, and he kept using it to cut off other people's sentences. I watched my sister watch him across the table, that particular stillness she'd developed over the years, the way she'd learned to take up less space whenever he was performing. My cousin Trevor, 23 and fresh out of a semester abroad in Barcelona, was telling a long story about a bar fight he'd witnessed on La Rambla. I wasn't really listening. I was watching my grandmother try to get Brett's attention to ask him to pass the gravy, and I was watching Brett not notice or pretend not to notice, which with Brett usually amounted to the same thing. It was my mother who finally reached across and touched Brett's arm. "Sweetheart, your grandmother-in-law is asking for the gravy." And Brett turned to her, slowly, with that smile he had that was technically a smile, and said, "She's got 2 hands, Linda." The table went quiet. Not all the way quiet. Not the kind that meant everyone heard. But the people nearest to him heard. My mom heard. My grandmother heard. I heard. My mother laughed it off. She did that, deflected discomfort with a laugh, smoothed things over, kept the surface from cracking. She reached past Brett to get the gravy herself and handed it to my grandmother, and the conversation started up again, and that was that. Except it wasn't. Because I had seen the look on my mother's face in that half-second before the laugh. And I had stored it somewhere. It got worse after dinner. The men had migrated to the basement. Brett's showcase, the 85-inch TV, and the wet bar he'd had installed in October. My uncle was down there, and Trevor, and 2 of Brett's friends who'd shown up after the meal claiming they'd just been in the neighborhood. I came downstairs to get my jacket from where I'd left it on the couch, and I caught the tail end of something. Brett was showing off the bar setup. One of his friends. Heavy-set red polo, the kind of guy who still thinks his frat years were his peak, was saying something about the bottle of Blanton's on the top shelf. And Brett was saying, "Yeah, that's the good stuff. We don't open that for just anyone." Then he saw me on the stairs. "Oh," he said, "we were just talking about you, actually." I stopped. "That's so? I was telling the guys about your job. The government consulting thing." He said it with air quotes. Actually used his fingers. "We were trying to figure out what you actually do all day." Red Polo laughed. Trevor, to his credit, looked at the floor. "I sit in meetings," I said. "Mostly." "See, that's what I thought." Brett set down his drink. He was enjoying this. I could tell by the way he positioned himself, turned slightly outward so his friends could see his face. Because Nora says you're, like, important, does important work. But nobody can ever actually explain what that means, so. He shrugged. I think she's just being a good sister. She's always been that, I said. No offense, none taken. I picked up my jacket. I was going to leave it at that. I was 3 steps from the stairs. Then I heard my mother's voice from the top of the landing. She'd come to call someone for dessert. And Brett raised his voice just enough, just precisely enough, that she would hear him. I'm just saying, Linda's been carrying a lot of weight for a long time worrying about this one. Must be a relief that at least one of your daughters figured it out. I heard my mother stop on the stairs, and I heard something in her voice. Not pain, exactly, but the cousin of it. The thing that lives next door to pain. When she said, quietly, Brett, that's not very kind. And Brett said, I'm just being real, Linda. Someone in this family has to be. And then he laughed, and Red Polo laughed, and I stood there with my jacket in my hands. I thought about the 4 years I had spent at Quantico. I thought about the 11 weeks of defensive tactics, the hand-to-hand instruction, the hours and hours in the gym before dawn. I thought about the 2 years after that doing field work in places I couldn't tell my mother about, and the commendation I had framed and put in a drawer because I had no one to show it to who would understand what it meant. I thought about all the things I had never said at holiday tables, all the times I had let people be wrong about me, let them fill in their small pictures, let them think what they needed to think. And then I put down my jacket. Brett, I said, come here for a second. He turned, still half laughing. What? Just come here. I want to show you something. He walked over because he thought I was going to apologize. That was the thing about men like Brett. They always assumed that when a quiet woman finally spoke, she was going to concede something. He walked over with his drink in his hand and that smile on his face, and he put his hand on my shoulder in that way he had. The proprietary grip. The I'm in charge of this dynamic grip. I took his wrist. I didn't think about it. The motion was old. Older than thought. Older than calculation. Rotational pressure at the joint. Weight transferred. Leverage applied. He went down to one knee before he understood what was happening. His drink hit the carpet. My uncle made a sound. Trevor stepped backward. I held the pressure for exactly 3 seconds. Enough to feel the give, enough for him to understand the geometry of the situation, and then I released. Brett sat on the floor of his own basement and looked up at me. I work in federal law enforcement, I said. I have for 6 years. I'm sorry I wasn't clear about that before. The room was silent. I looked at Red Polo. I looked at Trevor. I looked at my uncle, who was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then I walked upstairs. My mother was in the kitchen when I came up. She was standing at the sink with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking out the window at the neighbor's lights, and she turned when she heard me come in. She searched my face. What happened down there? I explained something to Brett. She looked at me for a long moment. Are you okay? I'm fine, Mom. She set down her mug, she came to me and put both hands on my face the way she had when I was small, and she looked at me with that specific expression. Not worry exactly, but the kind of attention that costs something. He's been awful to you for 5 years, she said. I know that. I should have said something. It wasn't your job to say something. You're my daughter. And I'm 32 years old, and I can handle myself. I covered her hands with mine. I promise you I can handle myself. She laughed, small and watery. I'm beginning to see that. My grandmother appeared in the kitchen doorway, one hand on the frame watching us. She was wearing her good cardigan, the dark green one she saved for family occasions, and her eyes were bright in the way they got when she was paying close attention. I heard a commotion, she said. Everything's fine, Gran. She looked at me with those sharp eyes of hers. Your grandfather was a quiet man, she said. Quietest man I ever knew. People always mistook it for weakness. She paused. He never felt the need to correct them either. She nodded once, like she'd settled something, and turned back toward the living room. I stood in my sister's kitchen and felt something unknot in my chest. Nora found me 20 minutes later, sitting on the back porch with a glass of water in the cold November air coming down from the north. She sat beside me without a word for a little while. I could hear the TV through the glass, Someone had turned the football game back on. Normal sounds. The architecture of a holiday being reconstructed. He's not going to say anything, Nora said finally. He's embarrassed. I know. He keeps saying his wrist is sprained. It isn't. She was quiet again. Then, how long have you been able to do that? A while. Why didn't you ever tell me? I thought about that. Because I didn't want it to be the thing that defined me in this family. I wanted to be a person first and a job second. I looked at the dark yard, the neighbor's oak, the sliver of moon above the roofline. I realized that backfired somewhat. Nora laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. And I laughed too, and for a moment it was just the two of us on a cold porch in November, the way we had been on 100 porches before this, kids in the back seat, teenagers on the fire escape, adults now with lives we'd built in separate cities. Are you going to report him? She asked. Quieter now. I looked at her. Do you want me to? She didn't answer right away. She wrapped her hands around her own glass and looked at the yard. He grabbed Mom's wrist, I said. Earlier, at the table. Did you see that? She closed her eyes. That's not the first time he's done something like that, I said. It wasn't a question. She didn't say anything. Nora. I know, she said. Her voice had gone very soft. I let the silence sit. I had been trained not to fill silences. That was something they taught you early. The productive use of quiet, the way people will say things into empty space that they won't say into questions. So I sat with it and the cold came down, and the tree across the yard lost a few more leaves to the wind. I don't know what I'm doing, she said finally. I know that's not a good enough answer. It's an honest one. I bought all this, she gestured vaguely back at the house. I thought if we had the house, if we had the thing, then maybe. She stopped. You don't have to explain it to me. I want to. She turned to look at me, and she had the face she'd had at 8 years old, that particular earnestness. I want someone to know I'm not stupid. I know what it looks like. I don't think you're stupid. Gran does. I thought about my grandmother in the kitchen doorway, the quiet man who never felt the need to correct people. Gran thinks you're going to figure it out, I said. She just thinks it might take you a little longer than you wanted. Nora was quiet for a moment. What did you do to his wrist? Pressure on the joint. Controlled. Did it hurt him? Yes. Good, she said. And then she looked surprised at herself. And then she laughed again. And I put my arm around her and we sat there while the temperature dropped another 2 degrees. And the sounds of the family came muffled through the glass. I called my supervisor from the parking lot before I drove away. Not about Brett. What had happened in the basement didn't meet any threshold that required reporting, legally speaking. He had initiated physical contact. I had applied a control hold. No one was injured. No one was going to the hospital. In a court of law, it would have been difficult to make anything stick, and I knew that, and Brett probably knew it too. I called because I had been carrying something for the drive home and I needed to put it down first. How was Thanksgiving? My supervisor asked. Educational, I said. She waited. She was good at waiting. My brother-in-law has been putting his hands on people, I said. Not at the level where we have jurisdiction. But I need someone to know I said that out loud, so it exists somewhere other than just my head. Okay, she said. It exists now. Thank you. Drive safe, she said, and hung up. I sat in the car for another few minutes, watching the lights in the windows. I could see my grandmother's silhouette in the living room, upright and still. I could see the flicker of the TV. At some point, Brett would reconstruct the evening into a story that made sense to him. Something about how I'd snapped, how I was unstable, how Nora needed to manage me better. That was fine. People tell themselves the stories they need. But he would also remember the floor of his basement. He would remember looking up. He would remember the 3 seconds before I let go. And the next time he put his hand on my mother's wrist in a way that wasn't right. Or on my sister's arm, or on anyone in that house. Something in the back of his mind was going to remind him that he didn't actually know what the women in this family were capable of. I put the Civic in reverse and pulled out of the driveway. It was a long drive back to DC and the highway was mostly empty, and I had the heat on low and the radio off, and somewhere past the Ohio border, I stopped for gas and coffee and stood under the fluorescent lights of a truck stop at 2 in the morning and felt, for the first time in a long time, completely at ease. Not because I had won something, not because I had proven anything, but because I had stopped pretending to be smaller than I was, just for one evening in one house, in front of a man who had decided I wasn't worth taking seriously. And it turned out that was enough. My grandmother called me the next morning, 8 a.m. sharp, before I'd even made coffee. "I looked you up," she said without preamble. "Your division, the commendation from 2021. A pause. Your grandfather would have liked you very much." I sat down on my apartment floor, still in yesterday's clothes, and I didn't say anything for a moment. "Gran," I finally managed. "Don't get emotional," she said briskly. "I'm just making an observation." Another pause, softer this time. "Come see me in Scottsdale in January. I'll make the lemon cake." "Yeah," I said. "Okay, I'll be there." She hung up. I sat on the floor a little longer. Outside my window, DC was waking up. Traffic on the bridge, a siren somewhere, the particular gray of a November morning on the East Coast. My life, ordinary and unspectacular in all the ways Brett had assumed, and extraordinary in all the ways he would never know. I got up and made coffee. That was enough too. I've been thinking about that truck stop outside Columbus ever since. 2 in the morning, fluorescent lights, bad coffee, and this strange feeling of being completely settled in my own skin. Not triumphant, not vindicated. Just settled, like something that had been slightly off balance for years had finally found its footing. I don't think what happened at Thanksgiving was really about Brett. Brett was just the match. The thing that caught fire had been sitting there for a long time. All those holiday dinners where I smiled and deflected, all those years of making myself easier to swallow by making myself smaller. I did it because I thought it was the kind thing to do, and maybe some of it was. But somewhere along the way, the kindness started curdling into something else, into a habit of disappearing. And I didn't notice until I was standing in a man's basement listening to him humiliate my mother and realizing I had quietly handed him permission to do it. That's the thing nobody tells you about letting people be wrong about you. It's not neutral. Every time you absorb a small injustice without comment, you're making a decision, and the decision compounds. Brett didn't become the man who grabbed my mother's wrist in one dinner. He became that man across 5 years of dinners where nobody pushed back, including me. So when I took his wrist, I wasn't just responding to that moment. I was responding to all of them. What I've come to believe, sitting with it now, is that there are 3 things a person actually needs to navigate a life with any kind of integrity. The first is knowing the difference between right and wrong and having the spine to act on it when it costs you something. Not when it's easy, not when everyone's watching, but in the specific moments when it would be far more comfortable to look away. My grandmother has it. She's had it for 81 years and never made a production of it. I watched her hand my mother the gravy without a word and understood something about quiet moral weight that I couldn't have explained to you before that night. The second thing is the ability to think clearly under pressure. Not to react, but to assess. To understand what's actually happening in a room. What's being said underneath what's being said. That's a skill. You can train it. I did for years, and I used it every time I chose to stay quiet at those dinners, and every time I chose, finally, not to. The third thing is endurance. Not the dramatic kind, not charging a hill. The ordinary kind. The willingness to keep going when the going is invisible, when nobody's watching, when you've been working at something for years with no acknowledgement and no fanfare, and the only evidence that it matters is internal. That's the work. Most of the real work looks like that. Brett thought I was the family disappointment because he could only see the surface of things. That wasn't a character flaw exactly. It was a failure of curiosity, the decision to stop looking once he had a story that satisfied him. A lot of people live that way. My grandmother called me at 8 in the morning and told me my grandfather would have liked me. I've rolled that around in my head every day since. He was a quiet man. People mistook it for weakness. He never felt the need to correct them. I'm starting to understand why.